Good afternoon, everyone. How are you today? So I'm doing well. A little stressed, but I'm doing well. I don't know what happened. You guys have really surprised us. This is an amazing turnout. Thank you for this warm Atlanta welcome for Dr. Hunter. We really didn't expect this turnout. We get fairly good turnout in most of our programs, but you guys pushed it over the edge today. Thank you. Before we get started, I'd just like to I don't think I introduced myself. My name is Anthony Knight, for those of you who do not know, and I'm the president and founder of the Baton Foundation. We started this enterprise 4 years ago this year to mostly educate black boys, excuse me, about black history and culture. But as we were developing our program for black boys, it became clear to us that we needed to create opportunities for adults to learn, for people from the communities, from the families from which these boys come, to learn and to further their own knowledge about black history and culture. And that's how these programs have kind of taken off, have become something and taken on a life of their own. And we really appreciate your patronage, your support, because this is really an amazing experience for us all. I also want to thank, before we get started, Dr. Hunter and all of the other scholars. As many of you who've been coming here know, many of these scholars come on their own steam. They're doing something in Atlanta, and they add us to their itinerary, or they just outright pay for their experience. Obviously, that cannot continue, but so far it's been just an amazing and a really humbling experience to know that the work we're doing is touching their hearts as well, and that they want to share with you and give us the opportunity to have them present their research and their scholarship with you. So I thank not only Dr. Hunter, but all of the others who've come before and who are yet to come. Before we get started, if I could just ask if you silence your cell phones, please. We certainly don't want to disrupt Dr. Hunter's lecture. And I want to acknowledge someone who maybe you've not met before, but the Baton Foundation board chair is here with us today, Makiba Dixon-Hill. If you could just kind of raise your hand. She's there in the middle. Thank you for coming today. We're entering into a new phase of growth. Makiba and the rest of the board and I are working on paperwork. In fact, we'll probably submit it this week. We have a local law firm working with us to do the paperwork to become a full-fledged nonprofit organization. We incorporated 4 years ago as a Georgia nonprofit, but obviously with the federal designation, that gives us a lot more latitude, not only to raise money, but to really start paying folks like Dr. Hunter, and just give us an opportunity to really grow and broaden what we've already begun. So as soon as that paperwork goes out, I will let everyone know who's on our email list. So if you're not on, please go to thebatonfoundation.org and register. But we believe it's going out sometime this week, so stay tuned. And then it's however many months process for the IRS to give us that designation. So I will formally introduce Dr. Hunter, after which she will present her lecture, and then she'll be signing books out in the lobby. The books are $21. We will most likely sell out. Again, we just did not expect this turnout. But if we do sell out before you're able to purchase a book, please know that Acapella Books, our book partner for all of our lectures, will be happy to pre-order the book for you. Emmy, who's at the table, also brought with her some book plates so Dr. Hunter can sign them, and we can put those in the books once they arrive. So if you don't manage to get a book today, we will take care of that before the week is out. So thank you. Tera Hunter is the Edwards Professor of American History and Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. She is a specialist in 19th and 20th century history. Dr. Hunter's work focuses on gender, race, labor, and Southern histories. Professor Hunter's most recent book, bound in Wedlock, Slave and Free Black Marriage in the 19th Century, published last year, has won many awards Among them, the Stone Book Award from the Museum of African American History and the Mary Nicholas Prize given to her by the Organization of American Historians. The book was a finalist for the Lincoln Prize, the Gettysburg College, and the Gelder Lerman Institute, and the Longman History Today Book Prize. Her first book, which many of you may know about, To Joy My Freedom, Southern Black Women's Lives and Labors After the Civil War, was awarded the H.L. Mitchell Award in 1998 and the Southern Historical Association, from the Southern Historical Association, the Letitia Brown Memorial Book Prize in 1997 from the Association of Black Women's Historians, and the Book of the Year Award, also in 1997, from the International Labor History Association. To Joy My Freedom was also named an Exceptional Book of 1997 by Library Booknotes. A native of Miami, for those of you who might be from Miami or from Florida, Dr. Hunter attended Duke University, where she graduated with distinction in history. She received a master's and Ph.D. from Yale University. Professor Hunter previously taught at Carnegie Mellon University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She joined Princeton's faculty in the fall of 2007. Professor Hunter has received numerous fellowships and grants, including the National Humanities Center Fellowship 2017 to 2018, and the Mary I. Bunting Institute Fellowship from the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University from 2005 to 2006. It gives me great joy and much pleasure to invite to the podium Dr. Tera Hunter. You can tell I'm technology challenged. Thank you, Ruben.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. First of all, thank you to Anthony for inviting me to be a part of this program. It was my pleasure to offer to come and speak. I really believe in supporting the kind of work that he's doing, working with young people. So I just said, let's try to figure out a time when I could come, when I would be in the city. So I'm so happy to be here and so glad that all of you are here on this wonderful day. It's such a nice day outside. I'm sure there's so many other things that you could be doing, so I really appreciate it. So I want to begin my lecture today with a personal story that also has historical significance. This is the merit certificate of my great-great-grandparents, Ellen Morrison and Moses Hunter. These are my paternal great-great-grandparents. And as you can see, my family is from Elberton, Georgia. So Atlanta is a place that I know pretty well from growing up here, but also, not growing up here, but having family here, family nearby, as well as doing research in my first book, dealing with Atlanta history. So Ellen and Moses are from Georgia. Moses was born free in 1835. In South Carolina, though he would become a slave by the time of the Civil War. His mother, Patsy Hunter, was born a slave in South Carolina in 1820, but was freed in childhood. Her stepfather, a free black man, Dublin Hunter, purchased her mother and at least two of her children, including Patsy. Their freedom was precarious, however, as several of the family members, including Moses, were re-enslaved by 1850. Ellen, on the other hand, was born enslaved in 1850 in Elberton, where the couple met and married and has been the family homestead ever since. She was the midwife who assisted in the births of still living family members. So we think about slavery as something in the distant past, but there's still living people today who actually knew enslaved people. We can trace the ancestry of Ellen and Moses back to two women. On Moses' side, there's Sally Hunter, who was born in Africa in 1790 and lived in Jamaica before she was brought to South Carolina. And on Ellen's side, the earliest known ancestor is Melinda Morrison, who was born in Henry County, Virginia in 1775. What is striking about my family ancestry is that every woman before Ellen going back to Sally and Melinda had children by white men. So my family tree puts in stark relief the preponderance of interracial pairings among my earliest known direct ancestors. It exposes the consequences of the sexual economy of slavery in my bloodline. Black women gave birth to the capital that helped to forge the nation's wealth, typically as a result of coerced sex with the very men who sired their biracial children and then turned them into commodities. They also gave birth to children by enslaved black men, whom neither mother nor father possessed, according to law and white society, and whom their enslavers literally capitalized. Their families included people of mixed racial ancestry, differing parentage, and mixed status. But Ellen and Moses shattered at least a century of mostly obligatory interracial pairings. Ellen was the first woman in my direct paternal line to give birth to children by a black man and marry him. They were the first intra-racial couple in the family who we can say with certainty were legally married. Ellen and Moses' marriage certificate, which I showed a minute ago, is typical of many such documents that were issued during the time of Reconstruction. This is a period right after the Civil War, when slaves received their rights to citizenship, to freedom, to a host of rights, including the right to marry. And their story encapsulates many aspects of African American marital love and struggles in the 19th century. Most of their ancestors did not have the same opportunity that they did to choose their own mates and marriage partners. Slaves were not allowed to marry legally, though with their master's consent, they could marry informally. When they decided to wed, they were forced to revise the standard wedding vows to make them more fitting with the absence of legal standing in civil law. As one white minister officiating at a slave ceremony frankly reminded the couple, their marriage was binding only until death or distance do you part. A black preacher stated this more bluntly by saying, till death or buck part you, meaning until the white man parted you. They were forced to reconfigure the idea that two flesh should become one, that man and woman like Adam and Eve should merge in all respects. As chattel property, the slaves were considered objects, not individuals with human rights. Marriage for them was not an inviolable union between two people, but an institution defined and controlled by the superior relationship of slaveholder over slave. So in the remainder of my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the definition that I use in the book, what is marriage? Give you a sense of the basic parameters of the term. And then I want to focus on Black love. This is Black History Month. It's been a kind of a bumpy Black History Month for lots of reasons. But I want to highlight some of the stories in the book that deal with Black love from the period of slavery, the Civil War, and then Reconstruction. So I define marriage as it was understood during and after slavery to encompass committed conjugal relationships, whether legal or not, monogamous, bigamous, or serial. Black heterosexual intimacy comprised a wide range of domestic arrangements out of necessity, not all of which were described as marriage. African Americans did maintain relationships that they called marriage, however, despite the lack of recognition their relationships did not have. Many of these relationships were formed by spouses who lived on separate plantations. So in that sense, husbands typically would live in a different plantation and would come and visit his wife and children in their cabins on the weekends. African Americans understood the importance of these relationships in terms of the emotional intimacies that they shared, but they also knew what was missing in the absence of legal recognition, including the lack of public recognition, the lack of state recognition in particular, and the exercise of personal freedom. African Americans understood the importance of contesting the standing of their relationships as integral to any prospects that freedom might hold for them on the most basic level. Marriage was by no means synonymous with freedom, but slaves and free blacks knew that their future as liberated people was less certain without the guarantee of marriage or the right to choose not to wed. How far could they go in the world without beloved kin, the foundation of which was secured on the bedrock of publicly protected marriage? Marriage was at the foundation of liberation because it had been at the foundation of racial subordination. But even as African Americans acknowledged the civil rights that were embedded in what was constituted as legal marriage, they also responded in diverse ways to conventional marriage ideas once they legally secured the right to marry after emancipation. Freedom meant not just access to conventions, to legal rights, but also to the ability to reject them. Yet even while African Americans, even white Americans who refuse to grant slave and free blacks protected rights often acknowledged that what looked like marriage among blacks was marriage de facto. Blacks and whites alike thus referred to slave marriage. They did not always understand or share the same ideas about what the term meant and under what circumstances it should be or could be applied to black intimacy. Slave owners considered marriage only those relationships that they affirmed and sanctioned. But ultimately, they could not dictate personal feelings. Sex, both interracial and intraracial, could be thrust upon slaves for whatever purposes that enslavers desired. But marriage was ultimately a mutual exchange of affections and services, a chosen emotional and social bond. Persons could be forced to play the roles and abide by the form, but that did not make a marriage. So a main objective in the book is to explore what was marriage, what did it mean to African Americans, what were the constraints that were imposed upon them in trying to realize those intimate relationships within the context of a slavery society. And the book covers these questions basically across the nation. Obviously, it focuses mostly on the South, but it also looks at the North, and it covers slaves, free blacks, and ex-slaves at the end of the 19th century, covering the entire century. So as I said, I want to focus on the theme of black love for the remainder of my talk because it's one of the universal themes in the book. And some of you may ask, what is black love? Is it any different from any other kind of love? And my book addresses both what is distinctive about black love and what is similar to love of others. To start with, it is the context in which love is created and experienced culturally, historically, that makes it distinctive. African Americans' efforts to create loving relationships was severely hampered by their legal status as chattel property and their conditions as former slaves. But black love also shares in the commonness of the feelings, the affections, the emotions that are deeply human, regardless of one's status in society. And so I began this project with being curious about love of all kinds. I was really inspired first by familial love, love between siblings, parents and children, as well as husbands and wives, cousins and play cousins, and the host of near kin relations that African Americans have historically devised for their survival and betterment. And these stories kept popping up in my research, especially in the Reconstruction period. And if you're interested in that period, the sources are really rich and often very touching. But they also reveal a lot of complexities about black families that at the time that I was working on the research really had not been written about very much in the historical literature. And so that's what really motivated my interest in this book, was capturing in particular marital relationships between enslaved people. The stories that I uncover defy long-standing stereotypes about African Americans that have been perpetuated by Anglo-American slaveholders that slaves were incapable of moral feelings or actions. Thomas Jefferson stated in the Notes on the State of Virginia in 1787, "Love seems with them to be more an eager desire than a tender mixture of sentiment and sensation. Their griefs are transient." So African Americans have had to defend their capacity to love and their actual love relations ever since Thomas Jefferson, if not before. And this quote really captures that sort of why we have to explain, why I have to actually do research to explain what Black love is and reveal it in the historical documents. Now, never mind the irony of Thomas Jefferson saying all that, because we know that he had other real-life experiences. I'll just leave it at that. And yet, love was a powerful force in the lives of the enslaved. It was one of the driving factors that led slaves to enter into wedlock with partners that did not have the protections and sanctions of the law. But marriage was motivated by other factors as well, like fear, anxiety, and practicality, any combination of which, along with affection, existed in a state of perpetual turmoil. Enslaved people had to ponder, should they or shouldn't they get married, when there was no guarantee that it could be sustained. And so some slaves actually waited, holding out to obtain their freedom first. Intimate relationships generated a number of problems that slaves had to contend with: the lack of bodily integrity, the public performance of sex acts for the pleasure of onlookers, the separation of kin, the lack of parental rights, and the constant threat of sexual exploitation of women. Slaves struggled to reconcile their status as chattel with the desire to form unions with partners of their choosing. It is no wonder that they would have been ambivalent about whether to wed or not, or under what circumstances. The fear of separation was especially haunting. The marriage vows that enslaved people exchanged was a powerful reminder of how tenuous their relationships could be, such that they could only promise fidelity to one another until distance do you part, until they were separated against their will. Enslaved people were taught from an early age by their parents and community to prepare for the day that they might be sold away from their loved ones. Couples were especially vulnerable because of the timing of marriage also coincided with their prime years as valuable laborers and commodities. So in other words, slaves could be sold in those prime years as young adults, precisely when they would be entering into marriage. And slave narratives are filled with these horrified recollections of these experiences. Many of you are probably familiar with the story of Henry Box Brown. He basically fled from slavery in Richmond, Virginia in 1849 via a box, a custom-made dry goods box, which he sent through the mail services. He mailed himself safely to Philadelphia, where he arrived 27 hours later. Now, most people know this dramatic escape, the story of the escape, but most people don't know what motivated it. What motivated it was his family, his wife and children were sold away from him. And he literally could not take it any longer and decided to take this dramatic chance of running away from slavery and then telling the story of what it was like to be an enslaved person, which he did on the lecture circuit in the US, and then he went abroad. Most slaves could not do what Box Brown did, but they were left to deal with their wounded feelings as best they could. Separations generated confusion and uncertainty about how to regard one's departed spouse and when it was safe to think that the breach was sufficiently severed to start a new relationship. This situation created serial marriages and overlapping entanglements, often with multiple spouses and partners. Slaves struggled to create relationships anew and social networks out of the fragments of existing kinfolk and strangers lumped together in pursuit of basic human needs for companionship, affirmation, affection, and solace. Love won their hearts and guided their feet. They managed to create many deep and meaningful relationships, despite the constraint. The influence of Christianity also made Black love distinctive. This is Sunday, after all, we have to talk about the church. It made it distinctive in ways that it infringed on couples' relationships. Slaveholders used their religion to defend the institution of slavery and to rationalize denying slaves the legal right to marry. This created a very troubling theology. White Christians typically supported informal marriages of slaves, though they made clear what mattered most. Those relationships were respected only up to a certain point, that point being where the profit margin emerged. And the ultimate authority of secular masters took priority. White ministers even performed some slave marriage ceremonies, but they did not always conduct what the slaves called biblical marriages, meaning that they did not always use the Bible. They sometimes would use random books that just happened to be sitting around like an almanac, which shows the kind of mocking that often took place even within the context of Christianity. The church imposed double standards on slaves. Despite the refusal to grant them full rights and legitimacy, the church judged slave couples harshly for marital infractions like adultery and divorce. The church was at once pro-slavery and pro-marriage, just not in a way that fully dignified and empowered the relationships of Black people. So I have several stories from the book that I want to share to highlight this theme of Black love. How did they hold on to love? How did they, or let go of the love in the context of slavery and quasi-freedom? And I want to start with the story of courtship, and this is from M.Phil Cooke, who was a literate enslaved man who lived in Richmond, Virginia, and he would later run for public office. And what is unusual about Cooke is he actually wrote an autobiography in the context of slavery. It wasn't published, it wasn't even discovered until a century and a half later. And the themes that he talks about in the book includes his interest in being a Christian man, his desire to be chaste while single, but it's also his sort of like ambition to get a wife and get married, have a family. And so he has this manner of being both self-effacing, but also exuberantly self-revelatory. And so it gives us a window onto the joys and struggles of an enslaved man. It's also what's interesting about it, it comes across as he's talking as a man who happens to be enslaved. So he captures scenes of courtship among urban slaves almost as though they were rituals existing in a bubble, removed at least momentarily from slaveholders' oversight. And that's probably what was the case in the context of slavery in Richmond. Enslaved people who lived in urban areas tended to have more autonomy and more ability to sort of move around the city than those who lived in the countryside and participate in social worlds outside of the narrow confines of plantations. So to quote from his narrative, he wrote, "The female sex was a great trouble to me in the first part of my manhood." End of quote. So the trouble was that, like many men coming of age, he simply could not figure out how to approach and attract a woman, any woman, which led to self-doubt and awkwardness in their presence. He seemed to fall in love, his words, with pretty women, his words, repeatedly, though he never gave himself a real shot at getting to know anyone and to try to figure out if his feelings were true. He would pace the floor in front of these women on the street, he said discreetly, but it's hard to imagine he could be that discreet, to see if he could muster the courage to speak or if they would say anything to him. He failed to make eye contact, to show the right gesture of interest, or to find a kind of opening to speak. In repeated frustration, he noted, quote, "And I was still standing single." He tried a different strategy at a neighborhood dance on a Sunday afternoon. He decided he would set his eyes on two women who he knew in advance would be there. He showed up early, dressed smart for the part, and as the girls arrived, he recalled, quote, "I would jump up and make my obeisance to them in the most polite manner and walk across the floor 2 or 3 times, after which I would take my chair and set it down by the side of one of the girls, just as close as I could get, after which I would set myself down and throw one leg across the other." He heightened the tension further as he decided to, quote, "look into her face, as much as if to say, 'Do you see me?'" See him? She had no choice. But hear anything in the form of words coming out of his mouth? No. Cooke was so struck with fear of saying the wrong thing that he could not say a word. He watched in silence and frustration as other men gracefully moved from one person to the next, carrying on conversations. To quote him again, "I was stuck as tight as a man could be against his will," he sighed. It would take years of trial and error before Cooke could find his first love. He did. But his first love was also broken up by one or both of their enslavers, though he would eventually marry. So that's where the kind of the theme of slavery comes back and grabs you when he talks about what happened to that first love basically being taken away from him. So the next story is about free blacks and mixed status couples, meaning free enslaved people married to each other. The families of enslaved people were often tethered to free African Americans in marriages of mixed status. These unusual arrangements compromise the status of the free person and sometimes pose unique dilemmas for them that put their families' safety and security in opposition to their freedom. In the antebellum South, lawmakers showed marked contempt for free black people, which was respected in a kind of a tidal wave of legal restrictions designed to really box them in, especially in the early decades of the 19th century, and especially in the 1850s. Many laws were passed to expel free blacks, to encourage them to submit to so-called voluntary slavery, in which freed people petitioned the state to be re-enslaved to white masters to avoid being expelled. Throughout the slaveholding states, mixed status families were the ones most deeply affected by these so-called voluntary slavery laws, as they were more often put in the position of having to choose between keeping their families together or having one or more members submit to enslavement. Some of them had already tried and failed to get exemptions. They could go to the legislatures and ask for exemptions from laws that forced them to leave the state. Thus, submission to legal slavery was the last resort. Their families were already circumscribed by the lower status of their enslaved kin, since they were likely to live and work alongside them on the same plantations under the same constraints. The privileges that free people enjoyed in reality were limited. Still, it was a huge sacrifice to give up their freedom. Even some free-born men, that is, they were born free, voluntarily submitted in order to stay with their wives. And so they were put in these binds often, and one bind also happened when their owners would move the enslaved spouse. And in some cases, the free spouse could travel behind them, but because of these laws trying to restrict the movement of free blacks, that wasn't always possible. Others faced problems when the enslaved spouse was sold away and the new owner was less than generous in supporting their marriage. In North Carolina, for example, one owner was willing to allow Percy Ann Martin, this was a woman who was a free woman, to live with her enslaved husband on his property. But when the husband was sold, the new owner pulled out this. There was a law in North Carolina that was passed in 1830 that said free blacks and enslaved people should not be allowed to marry. So he pulled out that law saying basically he would not allow the couple to live as a married couple. So her petition noted that, quote, she was attached to her husband and does not wish to be separated from him, that she is poor, has no property, and in these times of scarcity of provisions and high prices, she does not know how she is to support herself and is fearful she shall come to want. The willingness to submit to so-called voluntary slavery signified that some free blacks were prepared to prioritize marital and family ties at any cost. Even families already separated by manumission often reconsider the cost of being free. So there's a case of a man who actually was from Virginia, he was freed, he moved to Ohio, and he got to the point where, because he had left his wife behind in Virginia, he decided to come back to Virginia, which meant that he had to petition to be re-enslaved in order to be reunited with his wife. But he decided, in his words, it would be preferable returning to slavery to losing the society of his wife. So these examples amplify how African Americans who were free did not experience freedom as an absolute condition or right that they could take for granted. The increasingly oppressive tactics used by Southern states pushed more free people to weigh the cost of being forced apart from family members or remaining intact, even if it meant returning to bondage. So the next stories are about the Civil War and Reconstruction. The Civil War, which began in 1861, marked an important turning point. It's in the context of the war that African Americans began to marry legally. As Northern missionaries moved to the South and encountered enslaved people in contraband camps and on plantations that were confiscated by the Union Army, they began the process of remarrying couples to legitimize their bonds. Slaves called these marriages conducted under the auspices of the federal government marriage under the flag. The end of the Civil War, however, with the start of universal freedom, is when former slaves were allowed across all the former slaveholding states to marry legally, as laws were passed in the late 1860s and early 1870s. Finding lost loved ones was the most urgent concern of African Americans as the Civil War ended and slavery took its last breath. Couples who were split apart against their will had no idea if long-lost spouses might turn up again. Happy endings occurred more often than one might assume possible in a war-torn region. But for many couples and families, insurmountable obstacles kept them apart. Families separated in the context of the war had the best hopes of reconnecting compared to those who had been separated for longer periods. But the war itself could change things. It exposed people to new situations and environments. It put them in harm's way. If they survive, they might re-examine their sense of self, their relationships, and their place in the world. The war sparked new ways of thinking, especially for those exercising freedom for the first time, and for soldiers especially who traveled far afield. So here's an example of a husband who left his wife, Sherry Williams, and their children in Robertson County, Tennessee during the war, and parted with words of assurance that if need be, after the war, he would do everything possible to return home. But when the war ended, he did not return. His wife feared that he was dead. He was not. She discovered he had been spotted living nearby. Yeah, it's complicated. He did not come home. Something had changed. Sherry had to imagine a living husband within reach, yet out of her grasp. So Sherry Williams struggled to make sense of this new world in which she found herself. Her beloved husband and the father of her children had not returned, seemingly of his own accord. So she wrote a letter pleading with him not to forget her, their children, and the promises that he had made before he left. Sherry had a very clear sense of their mutual obligations as a married couple, despite the fact that they began their relationships as slaves. As far as she was concerned, nothing had changed since they had gained their freedom. To quote her letter, "You was mine when you left, and you are yet mine. I shall always claim you and love you. And if you will come now, I will always treat you as kind as I can, and I can do more for you and wait on you better now than ever." So she still wanted to be his lifelong spouse. She pleaded with him to return, even if just for a moment. She sought his protection and guidance, the kind expected of a husband. She talked about their growing son. He was in that difficult stage when boys needed their fathers. She said he was acting very wild. She also understood her new rights. She had not likely married in the context of the war under the flag because they were separated. But the end of hostilities brought new privileges and responsibilities for the marriages of all ex-slaves. She alternated her language between affection and threats. Here she goes again. "I have the right to your love and protection. And if you don't come, I will compel you to come." She asked him politely if he had taken up with another woman. She implored him to come back, even if just for an hour. She wanted closure, if nothing else. But she stubbornly refused to settle for that alone. To quote her again, "I love you too well to be harsh with you or treat you amiss, and I do not want to see you punished. But if you do not come, I will have you confined." Yes. Sounds like today, doesn't it? Freedom offered former slaves new opportunities regarding how to conduct their love lives that they had never experienced previously. All couples formed under slavery came to a crossroads where individuals, twosomes, had to decide whether to move forward with the same spouse after slavery ended, and if so, how. But their situations were complicated by the continuing legacy of slavery, which could not simply be forgotten or overwritten by new rules and declarations. Those whose masters had forcibly mated them against their will were now able to part ways. But should they? Sometimes, regardless of the circumstances, forced partners learn to adapt and adjust to their situation and could even develop genuine feelings of affection. In some cases, one person in the couple wanted to stick it out, while the other did not. The latter predicament occurred when the ability to connect with their true love interests had been foiled by their slaveholders' interference under slavery. Longings that had been breached or denied could now be fulfilled. So here's a story of 4 individuals and 3 couples. So stick with me, it's complicated. Ellen and Charlie Carter, Walker and Alice Wade. So they offer an example of sort of the messiness that could be created when unfulfilled love was not allowed to blossom. Ellen and Charlie were thrust together as slaves, but without any formalities of a marriage ceremony. Ellen had been courting Walter Wade, but her slaveholder and possibly his objected to their marriage. Walker got another woman pregnant, Alice. To quote, and as he had gotten her into this fix, he married her to save her. Alice Alice's owner threatened to sell her if she became pregnant without marriage. So they did marry in a ceremony and started to have children together, and they had other children together. Walker left to join the Army and returned home to Alice, but their relationship began to fall apart. He said because Alice was a drinking woman. Walker said that he stood it as long as he could, and he left without formalizing their relationship when he had the chance to do so during the Civil War. Meanwhile, the other couple, Ellen and Charlie, also had children. When Charlie left to join the Army, they had one child. When he returned to Ellen at the end of his service, they had another. But the two would soon part. Ellen never forgot Walter Wade, the other guy. She stated, quote, "Walker waited on me," meaning he courted her, "when we were young, and my owners made me take up with Charlie Carter. But I never loved Charlie. And I did love Walker Wade as a girl and on up to today, and I never cared for any other man." So Walker and Ellen resumed an affair after the war, when they were each still married to their respective spouses. Alice wanted to legalize her marriage to Walker because she wanted to be baptized, and the minister at her church said, "You have to get married first, formally, before he would baptize her." And she claimed that Walker refused her because of Ellen, and that's what drove her to drink. She said, quote, "They led me to a dog's life for 6 or 7 years." So Alice and Walker finally split, but not before they had another child together in 1878. Ellen and Walker reunited and legally married less than a year later. Alice tried to prevent the nuptials, but was told there was nothing she could do about it. She was not Walker's legal wife. So this story dramatizes the dilemma of former slaves who chose to pursue the true love that had been denied to them through no fault of either party. The turmoil that resulted when they were forced to form involuntary unions, and the determination they often felt to follow their hearts when they were able to do so once freedom came. So to conclude, African American marriage under slavery and quasi-freedom is a story of twists and turns, of intimate bonds being formed, sustained, broken, and repeatedly recreated under the stresses and strains of oppression. African Americans were denied the legal rights to marriage and control over their own children, to perpetuate their status as laboring bodies, to further the expansion of capitalism fueling the global market. Slavery as a permanent inheritable condition could not exist otherwise without constricting the rights of Black intimate relationships. All African Americans, regardless of status, whether they lived in the North or the South, whether they were free or enslaved, faced harsh reprisals from racist ideas and practices that impacted their intimate relationships. Slavery put a strain on all Black marriages and families. They were denied the privileges of kinship, but they were stigmatized for failing to live up to what were considered society's norms. The standards for judging them have always been unfair, as Black families, ever since slavery, have been subjected to continual disruptions, violations, and negations. They've never been left to rise or fall on their own accord. And yet, despite the reign of terror that slavery spawned, and no matter how much it altered and disfigured Black marriages, it did not and could not annihilate them, nor could it destroy Black love. African Americans lived and loved and were creative and resourceful and resilient in building marriages and kinship ties that functioned for their survival. We should never lose sight of the depth of feelings and affection that undergirded these relationships and the sacrifices that blacks were willing to make for the sake of preserving them. The challenges African Americans have faced over centuries is without a doubt reflected in my own family history. Going back to those earliest known ancestors, Sally and Melinda, Ellen and Moses began to break the mold in 1872 by putting their marriage on legal footing. But that alone could not save them or their descendants from the multiple trials that awaited their new fates as second-class citizens in post-slavery America. Thank you.
And I think if anyone has questions, we have mics on either side of the room if you'd like to ask Dr. Hunter a question regarding her lecture. Don't be shy.
In your research, did you come across much in relationship to miscegenation?
Yes. I mean, I started with that in terms of my own family tree. I guess I can but I made a deliberate decision to focus on intra-racial relationships, to look at African Americans married to other African Americans. So the interracial relationships certainly come into play in terms of, because African American families are included interracial people, right? But I wanted to really focus more on black families in terms of those marriages that were between black people. I mean, there's a way in which we have sensationalized those interracial relationships, going back to Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And so that's why the book is really more, comes up, but it's really focused on the relationships among African Americans. Yeah.
In your research and in your work, what would you suggest to black people as strategies to continue to support intra-racial marriages and relationships and strengthen the bonds that clearly have been fought to create?
Okay, so I'm a historian. I have friends in the audience who's a psychologist. Paula, where are you? Maybe you can help me with this. I would say that I can't really answer that question as a historian, but I would say that part of what we need to do is to understand this history. Because I think what happens is when we don't know the history, we also have these false myths about our past, which then influence our relationships today. So just to give you one example, so part of my research, part of the interest in writing this book also came from a lot of the conversations that are happening today about black marriage. And people will say things like, marriages today are a function of slavery. No, they're not. So I talk about, and I bring this up in the epilogue of the book, because if you think about the entire 19th century, if you think about the entire period of African Americans' presence in this new world, the so-called New World, and by the way, this is the 400th anniversary of the arrival of Africans in colonial Virginia as enslaved people. But there's a whole century before 1619 that Africans were present in Florida and South Carolina. That's a whole other story. But my point is that there's a long history of African Americans being denied rights to family and marriage, centuries of that happens. The Civil War ends, marriages are regularized. By the beginning of the 20th century, African Americans marry nearly universal. So, and they're marrying slightly more than white people because they're marrying younger. So how do we get from 1900, where virtually every person of adult age will, get married, to the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, where that pattern is reversed, where we have a large marriage gap between blacks and whites, and African Americans are not, the majority are not married. How do we blame slavery for that? So we need to be careful about what we attribute to what is causing the problems in our communities. And a lot of it, I mean, the pattern really started in the mid-20th century with respect to lots of things that are happening in the economy. Permanent unemployment started to happen in the 1940s. That number has grown every single decade since 1940. Permanent, meaning you're kicked out of the economy, you can't get a job, you'll never get a job. Underemployment, low wage work, all those things, mass incarceration. That's a huge factor in the low marriage rates. All of those things are combining to reduce the rates of marriage for African Americans. So understanding what's creating those problems is one of the things I think will help us to be able to advance, to be able to create families that are healthy, that are productive. If we don't sort of put ourselves against each other and blame each other for things that we really aren't responsible for, but then hold ourselves accountable for the things that we are responsible for at the same time. So that's a short answer to that question.
Thank you for your talk, and thank you for giving us this context for better understanding our history. This was really great. I have a question about your family tree. So you were able to go pretty far back, and I've been doing a bit of searching through Ancestry, but it can be difficult because some of the stuff just stops because they weren't keeping records on us, or we wouldn't have names. We were just a number in the record. So I was just wondering if you had any suggestions or tips for any of us who might be interested in learning more about our own family.
Yeah, so it's a process that takes many, many years and decades. So I have to give credit to my family historian, who's not me. My family historian is Bruce Hunter, who is my dad's first cousin. He lives in Connecticut. He is an engineer by training. And he took up the family history, way, way back. And he's the person that came up with that marriage certificate. And he actually went to the courthouse in Elbert County and got that marriage certificate. And so he's the person that's been, and so we talk because he'll do the research, and then he's like, well, what does this mean, and what does that mean? So I help him with the interpretation part. But the point is that the work that he has done over the years started to really escalate with Ancestry.com. Ancestry.com is an amazing database. It has all kinds of records that you would once have to you'd have to travel to special libraries to get. So it takes time because it's not something you can just sit down and do in one sitting. And gradually, you build the information, you do cross-checks, and also with Family Ancestry, Ancestry.com, you also have other people creating their family trees. And then that's how you start to get the cross-fertilization. I'm not a big fan of DNA. My cousin Bruce did a DNA test, however, and one of the things that was useful is that it does help to rule people in and out of your family tree. So you can tell, well, is this person related to me or not, based on having DNA evidence available. So I would just say it's something it's a community project also. So it's not something that one person can do by themselves. So, yeah.
Thank you. I had a question because you wrote in the book about Black women and tithable labor.
I'm sorry?
Tithable labor and taxing of Black women. I think it's early in the book.
Oh, the tithes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that.
Okay, so she's referring to, in the early part of the book, I talk about sort of some of the things that were happening in early American society when they were sort of beginning to legalize the status of African Americans as permanently enslaved people. And one of the laws that was passed initially, there are a couple. There was one that basically said that the status of the mother will determine the status of the children. So that was a key law that started in Virginia around 1660 that really kind of sealed the deal of making slavery permanent because obviously it's the women who reproduce children. So if you, as a slave owner, own the mother and then you own her children, it means that you basically have control over her future progeny. And so that law was really important. It also violated English common law because in English common law, a person's status was based on their father's, not their mother's status. It also allowed white men who had children by Black women to not have any responsibility. And it meant also that Black men had no legal rights to their children. So it served multiple purposes. So that's one law. The law that she was referring to was a law, it was a tithe that was passed, again in Virginia. So tithes were just ways that the colony collected money from people who lived in the colony. And so they set a tithe based on the number of working people that you had in your household. But what it did was it made a distinction between European workers and African workers, specifically women. It exempted European women. So if, for example, if you were a white family, the man as a head of the household would not have to pay a tithe based on his wife's wages or his daughter's wages. If you were a black man, however, you had to pay a tithe based on your wife's wages and your daughter's wages. So essentially, it imposed a burden, right? And so it made it was another impediment that people had to getting married. If the man had to pay these taxes, he might think twice about marrying a woman and marrying a black woman. And sometimes that actually did lead to the question about miscegenation. Sometimes that would lead to interracial marriages. So it was a really important sort of founding law, again, that sealed this notion of black women, of women of African descent being constitutionally different from women of European descent, and that had direct economic consequences for black families.
So I study children's literature, and I'm always very interested to see or think about what the child's response was during these different periods. Have you come upon any papers or responses from children to thinking about their parents being married or unmarried, because I was reading an article that talked about there being multiple families within one plantation economy, and you have a father who has multiple families that are situated within that economy. Have you had any responses or seen any responses?
Yeah, so, I mean, there are lots of accounts, but unfortunately, they're retrospective, right? So it's basically adults talking about recalling what their childhoods were like and remembering what they felt during childhood, as opposed to children writing as children. But if you read any of the slave narratives, I mean, they talk a lot about that feeling, from Frederick Douglass to Harriet Jacobs. I mean, you know, all the famous ones, all the ones that are not so famous. I reference Henry Box Brown. In the beginning of the narrative, he talks a lot about, you know, when he was a child and what his mother taught him, and how his mother tried to prepare him for the separation that eventually did occur, and what that was like what did he feel as a child, getting that information. So I would encourage you to read, there's a website that University of North Carolina does, uncsouth.edu, I think is the name of it. But it has virtually every published autobiography, slave narrative that's available. And so you can just go online and they're all available for free. But literally, almost every single one talks about, you know, what they experienced as children, what that was like. So I would encourage you to look at some of those. It's a website. It's University of North Carolina website. It's called Documenting the South. So if you just Google Documenting the South, you'll find the website.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to share some information. I, too, have been researching my family tree for about 9 years. And certain branches I've actually been able to go back to the 15 or 1600s, but that's due to the white ancestry that I was able to stumble upon. I just relocated here from Virginia about 3 months ago, and I had subscribed to Ancestry for several years to obtain different census records and historical records. I just wanted to let you all know that one of the National Archive Centers is located in Morrow, Georgia, which isn't too far from here, and you can go there and obtain those records for free. Mm-hmm. All you have to do is give them your ID and sign in, and you can even print them out, no cost.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your scholarship. In the text, you talk about sweethearting and the presence of polygamous and multifamily creation. I'm a sexual ethicist by training, so the first question that's in my wheelhouse. So I'm interested in how you found and how we should look for historical records to uplift the polygamous stories. Because part of what I found really fascinating in the text was how heterosexual marriage then became the norm and invalidated all of the functioning polygamous relationships that were present before that. So where would we go for that type of historical data?
Yeah. So it's a really hard thing to research. It comes up, in lots of different kinds of sources. And it's not polygamous, and I'm sort of ambivalent about using the word polygamous because it's not polygamous in the sense that, we think about polygamy. I mean, if you think about practices of polygamy came from West Africa, especially among those enslaved people who came from Islamic backgrounds. That form of polygamy is kind of rare in that, in the way it was practiced is in Islam, it's a voluntary thing, right? Everyone's participating, everyone is consensual. That's more rare. Bigamy is more, bigamous relationships are more evident, and sometimes even right after slavery, because those enslaved people they were put in a dilemma. So they thought they were, had been separated from a spouse. They've moved on, they've married someone else, and now that spouse comes back after the war. So now you have two people who you love. Which one do you choose? And so sometimes they created these arrangements that were unusual, where the man would actually live together with both women at the same time. Those kinds of stories come up in the Reconstruction materials. There's tons and tons of materials available in that era because of the Civil War having happened and the federal government being present and all the documentation that went on. So that's probably the easiest place to find it. Another place is in some of the slave narratives. The WPA narratives, these were interviews that were done in the 1930s of formerly enslaved people. And in some of those narratives, they talk about those relationships, those bigamous relationships. So you get like tidbits of information about that, but not a lot of sort of explanation or description of the nature of the relationships. But post-slavery is when you start to see, that choices are being made and consented to. As opposed to what often happened is that men especially would move around a lot by virtue of their work, enslaved men. And so sometimes they might live on two plantations, and they might have a wife on both plantations. The women may or may not consent to that arrangement. But that was also another scenario where you would see multiple spouses. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Do you have any references in your book or otherwise that speak about the relationships between enslaved African men and who married into the native population?
I don't have a lot on that, again, because I just focus on intraracial relationships, but there is increasingly interest in Native American, African American relationships. So other historians have done some of that work. So I could definitely give you some references for that. If you email me, I could send you some references. But that's a really interesting topic, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, mine is sort of a question, but an observation. With regard to your background as a historian, what would you propose, the answer to this suggestion is, African American women or women that are of color seem to be the most unmarried women in this country and on the planet. Right. As a historian, what would your answer be to that? Right.
So again, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about how the marriage patterns have changed over time, over the course of the 20th century, right? And so why are we less married? Because part of it, it's complicated. Let me just say that from the start. And I'm not going to answer all the reasons. I can't answer all of them in this time, but partly it has to do with, one, marriage is changing for everyone. If you look at Western societies across the world, marriage is going down, right? For a number of reasons having to do with changes in the way we think about marriage, the way we think about sexuality, advancements of women in society. It's now okay not to be married at a time, it used to be where it was really required to have a respectable standing in society, whether you're a woman or a man. So all those things are happening. But in terms of what's happening with black women in particular, it goes back to the ways in which black marriage rates are declining by virtue of economic circumstances and mass incarceration. Those are the two dominant trends that are infiltrating black marriage rates. And so when it comes to mass incarceration, of course, disproportionate numbers of men are literally being removed from black communities. So you have literally, in terms of heterosexual marriage, you have an uneven number of men to women. Surprise, you can't get married if you're heterosexual if you don't have men in those communities to marry. That's part of it. Women also tend to marry less interracially. Black women do. Again, very complicated, right? So black men marry twice as much as black women do outside of the race. So add that to the equation as well. So all of those things are, I think, infringing on the ability of black women for those who want to get married, right?
Right.
That would be my short answer.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I've noticed when I go to the movies, if I'm looking for a movie that features a black relationship, functioning relationship in the movies, there is none. There's never. I mean, we just recently, as a group, I have a meetup group that's here now, to see if Beale Street Could Talk. I mean, it was a love story, but it was a tragedy. And our love stories are always tragic. It always ends in tragedy, or it's very abusive. We never have a functional relationship. I mean, after Bill Cosby with the Huxtables, we've not had any functioning relationships. And I don't know if it's a strategy because, our teenagers, what was it? There's I think it's not Plato, I'm not sure. Anyway, there's a quote that says, life imitates art or art imitates life. And so if our children, see where we're always dysfunctional in the movies, aside from there being, single family homes, they don't have other examples. Maybe their grandparents, but I think the media and I think it's the media, is the film industry and the music industry has a big influence, because when we were growing up, we heard love songs by the OJs and the Temptations. Those were love songs. Men sung about loving women. Now, it's like we hear these derogatory terms to describe each other. And I really think that has affected our young people and how they think about each other, and how they would view marriage. Because why would you marry a bitch or a thug? Because that's what our young people call themselves. So I just think, we're just really, there's no black love. You can see, like, for example, I just watched Bird Box. You can see where black men will love non-black women on the big screen, but you don't see it between us.
Yeah.
And,
I won't say very much because I don't feel like I'm an expert on popular culture, but I mean, one show that I like is Queen Sugar. And I feel like it does have that complexity of black love and family. I mean, the way in which that family is depicted, I really think it does some good work in terms of creating alternative images from the kind of negative images that may be more typical. So I think I would just say that. Queen Sugar, watch that. Yeah.
Excuse me, Dr. Hunter, these are our last two questions.
Okay, thank you.
Tara, thank you for writing your book on Black love, because
Thank you.
because information is power. And I think there was a first question was about why there's so much pain as it relates to marriage and black love. And so much healing needs to take place related to our relationships. But it starts with the truth. And so we often don't have the truth. Do you know of any documentaries that are that are dealing with this topic of Black love? And if not, then I challenge all of us in the audience, if Atlanta's the new Hollywood, then we can begin to insist upon a change of the images and the stories that can then impact our health and well-being.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know of any such documentaries. And I teach a class on African American family history, so I'm always looking for, films that I can show to my students. And so far, I can't say that I know of any. No.
Okay,
Sorry.
so Tara, we have the historian and we have the psychologist. Y'all work that out. So Tara, here's my question. Having known you, there's a bunch of us here. What made you become a historian? I want to know why.
That's easy. So some of my friends are here from Duke, which is where I went to college. And it was at Duke that I became really interested in history. I went to college, like a lot of people, wanting to be a lawyer. And then I got there and I discovered, no, not really. And in the meanwhile, I was introduced, I had the most amazing history professors. Some of you remember Professor Gavin, among many others. Fortunately, Professor Gavin died a couple years ago. But anyway, what really drew me to history was the way my professors approach history through original research. So freshman year, sophomore year, they took us to the archives. We were looking at original sources, digging in these records. I hadn't done that in high school. High school was very dry, history. And so having history come alive for me in that way through research is what really drew me in. And then having professors who were very engaging and very open, and you could go and talk with them, and they were very encouraging about you should consider going to graduate school. And so part of it had to do with, I see myself as a person, as a historian, as a storyteller, as someone who excavates those stories that have been untold or undertold. Sort of going back and finding those stories that we don't know anything about, or the larger public doesn't really know much about, if anything. And then, sort of bringing those stories to life. And so for me, it sort of satisfied a mission that I had when I wanted to be a lawyer. Because what I really wanted to do was to make a difference, right, in terms of justice. That's what really drew me to wanting to go to law school, was I wanted to be able to do something that would make our society more just. And as a historian, I still feel like I have that same mission, and that purpose can still be fulfilled through historical research. Because again, until we know the truth, we can't act on our past in a way that's principled unless we know where we've come from, what we've been through as a nation, and reckoning with, really telling the whole story, the truth and nothing about the truth, about the larger American narrative. So that's my mission, is to really integrate. So when you take a class with me, my students, whatever the class is, I never lose sight of the fact that these stories about African Americans, but every single student, no matter what your background is, you have a shared legacy that includes African American history, and everyone needs to know that. So that's why I became a historian. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hunter, and what a really great question. Thank you for asking that. What a perfect way to end the lecture. Dr. Hunter is going to sign books out in the lobby, and we really want to thank you for turning out today. One of the things, my background, from many of you may not know, is actually in museum education. So I've spent over 20 years working in museums in this country. And I used to hear a lot from colleagues, and even from Black people as well, that Black folks, we don't come to things like this. we don't want to know more. And so the museums, many of the museums at which I worked, did not find it necessary to do ongoing programming and meaningful programming that had Black people at the center. So I really thank you for being here today. Thank you for supporting us and the programming we do. Please come back next month and in the months to come. Next month, I'm going to focus 2 programs, one on Selma, Alabama. As you know, the anniversary of Bloody Sunday is next month. And we're also doing a program next month on domestic abuse and violence in the Black family, in the Black community. Part of our mission is really to have conversations about things that are really hard for us to have conversations about. And so our conversation next month is about domestic violence and abuse. So please join us. Thank you for coming today. If you have to go, have a great rest of the weekend. If you're going to hang out and get your book signed, we'll see you out in the lobby. Thank you so much.